The United States empire, as we know it, has basically existed since World War II. Essentially, the rest of the world's manufacturing capabilities were destroyed. So the United States was kind of the last man standing. The United States was able to be the producer for the entire world and get really rich exporting manufactured goods throughout the rest of the world in the decades following World War II. It also helped that at Bretton Woods in 1944, it was decided that the United States dollar would be the main reserve currency, where the United States dollar was backed by gold and other countries would back their currencies by purchasing United States dollars, holding those in reserve, therefore giving their currencies some value as a link to gold. So that rapidly increased demand for the US dollar made it a strong currency, and this set the tone for the United States to really become an empire. Now, you know that I have plenty of criticism for the United States imperialism and the way it behaves overseas, but it has also kept the world relatively peaceful since World War II. Basically, anybody who was doing business with the United States was under one economic umbrella, and other countries couldn't fight other nations within that same bloc, or they would risk losing their status to trade and prosper with these other countries. So Japan and South Korea, whatever differences they had to set them aside if they wanted to both benefit from this economic trading. Same with all the European powers. And the United States was world police, patrolling the entire oceans of the earth, ensuring that trade made it where it was going. So all these countries benefited from the United States basically keeping the waterways safe enough to trade. And that is how the United States exerted its empire. But there are some reasons to believe that the United States' days as the global dominant empire are coming to an end. One reason is the weakening position of the dollar as the world reserve currency. A lot of countries are diversifying their reserve holdings so that it's not just the United States dollar backing them. And this has been a trend since the 1970s, since 1971-72, when the dollar was fully removed from the gold standard. So it lost that hard money backing, which has caused massive inflation since the 1970s. Not being pegged to gold and printing more dollars means that the value of each dollar is going to continuously decline. So without that, the entire reason for holding US reserves sort of went away, except for the fact that it's been accepted for so long as the reserve currency that it's basically inertia that's keeping it going. But more and more countries are diversifying out of the US dollar as a reserve currency. And obviously a lot of central banks are buying gold. So even if their actual currency isn't backed by gold, if the country, if the jurisdiction issuing the dollars has gold, that is something. So US dollar has global demand. If that global demand falls off a cliff, we could see much worse inflation than we're seeing right now, because if the demand for the dollar wasn't 8 billion strong, however many people are in the world, all sort of wanting dollars, and that demand goes instead to 330 million Americans are the only ones that want dollars, well, that's a lot of dollars that have already been created, flooding the market, and the value could really fall quickly. So weakening US dollar is one reason the United States empire appears to be in terminal decline. The failure of its military interventions in the Middle East. The mission was not ever really accomplished in Iraq. It's now a war-torn country with different factions battling each other and a lot more terrorism. Afghanistan obviously was a failure after 20 years, pulled out in just this like pathetic way. You know, civilians clinging to aircraft as they're taking off, the Taliban closing in much quicker than the experts predicted, service members dying in terrorist attacks towards the end of it as they're trying to evacuate people. Just really horrible. Billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of equipment left to the enemy, to the Taliban. So it was just a real huge failure. The world sees that. Not that the United States should have stayed in Afghanistan forever, but there was a way to pull out and end it without giving so much away to the Taliban and having your sworn enemy immediately regain everything that you had fought for, with the thousands of lives of Americans, not to mention all the innocent Afghanis that were killed. And then at home, these absurd priorities that have nothing to do with freedom and prosperity, the entire things that this country was founded on. Instead, we're, woke purging the military. The standards have fallen. Go figure, recruitment in the military is way down despite some of the largest sign-on bonuses ever. Instead of trying to promote business and make it an easy environment for people to start businesses and prosper and trade and create, what we have is this environment where you're demonized if you're successful, you're demonized if you're rich. And that's another sign that the US empire is in decline. But the central government of the United States still is wasting tons of resources trying to hold on to this empire. But it's sort of the worst of both worlds because it's really losing its power and influence while still expending just as much effort and money to try to keep that. And now we see war breaking out in Europe. China's aggressive against Taiwan. And there's a lot of evidence that the United States is not going to continue maintaining this global security network, which means trade could suffer and other countries that were formerly in that bloc could start fighting again. But the truth is that the United States doesn't need a global empire. They've got an empire at home. The United States, from ocean to ocean, is already a vast empire, has tons of fertile land, has a huge workforce, has manufacturing capabilities, has internal waterways that are navigable. There's so much going for the United States geographically. It's still a relatively stable jurisdiction with rule of law, even though that has been fading somewhat, but that's another story. It could still turn a lot of this around and really maintain and grow that prosperity at home. But it cannot continue doing that by running multiple trillions dollars deficits that they cover with basically printing money and doing other things that blunt the progress, like dictating to what states can do instead of allowing each state to compete in a marketplace and improve their politics, improve their governments, improve their economies. That would really be a way to strengthen the United States. So if I was emperor, here's what I would do to rebrand and restructure the United States to remain a powerful global force for good. First, strip down to an organization focused solely on defense, foreign affairs, and interstate infrastructure, not interstate commerce. So the major benefit of having the United States federal government is that state governments, and for a long time European governments and other governments around the world, did not have to focus on defense. The United States military was basically the defense budget for all of them. That centralized defense does leave the states in a much better position to defend themselves against outside forces. So if that was basically all the federal government did, that could be an effective organization and it could benefit the states. They could focus on internal matters and leave the outside to the United States federal government. But this would also put the federal government on a leash. Remember, the United States government doesn't actually hold any territory outside of Washington, D.C. So how would it maintain this military? It would need the states to contribute soldiers and money in order to maintain this military. And if the states were voluntary participants in this organization, voluntarily delegating their power to Washington, D.C. to conduct foreign affairs, then the states would have control over the federal government and could defund this military or stop contributing soldiers to this military if they no longer thought the organization was in their best interests. That's a point I'm going to get back to in a minute. And finally, I said interstate infrastructure, not interstate commerce. So maintaining the highways that go in between states, but absolutely not regulating trade in between states. That should be up to each individual states coordinating with other states, which the federal government could absolutely help with as a mediator. So basically, it would become a facilitator to broker these trade agreements, treaties, and voluntary cooperation among the states. Voluntary being key. They don't pass laws and say this is how the states are going to interact. They try to maintain the mutual interests of the states and act as mediator. And remember, under this scenario, everything else is being left to the states. The federal government is doing defense, foreign affairs, and interstate infrastructure. Everything else is up to the states. So the federal government's not trying to do education. It's not trying to maintain a welfare state. It's not running health insurance portals or regulating businesses. States handle everything else. And a key aspect of this that I mentioned earlier is that you have to allow the states to join or leave freely if they want to be represented internationally and defended by the federal government, and if they value this union with other states for defense, for mutual trade, for all the benefits that go with it. But if they decided that that was no longer in their best interest, they would be completely free to go their own ways and not be threatened with violence or force. And that's a way to hold the federal government accountable. Not many states are going to want to pay for and contribute soldiers for foreign adventures that they don't clearly see benefiting them at home. But there's another key aspect to maintaining that control, and that is that the state governments would be paying taxes to the federal government, not the citizens. So no income tax, no taxes on individuals at any level from the federal government. As individuals, we would have almost no interaction with the federal government. It would all be through our states. And the states' legislatures, the state governments, are the ones that would have to pony up the cash for the federal government. So all federal taxes are paid by the states, which, again, can freely leave if they don't like the services and products they're getting for that money that they're spending. So it's a customer relationship. What is the federal government doing for me as a state? And if it's not worth it, can I afford that better on my own? Then they can go their own way freely. And again, here you can defund the federal government, at least of your portion from your state, if they're not representing your state properly and treating them properly. This is similar to the idea in the original Constitution before, in 1913, the 17th Amendment was passed. Senators were elected by state legislatures, which actually gave state governments representation in the federal government. So the Senate worked for state governments and the House worked for the people, directly elected. And that was a really good balance of power to give the state governments representation in the federal government and be able to influence it. After the 17th Amendment, after 1913, the senators, the U.S. senators, became just another statewide election from the people. So the state governments have no actual representation in Washington, D.C. right now. They have no control over D.C.'s government, and that's what's allowed. That's part of what's allowed D.C. to become a dictator to the states instead of the other way around, which is the way it was supposed to be, states controlling the federal government for their own purposes, for mutual benefit between the states, and to maintain that security against outside threats. And finally, the federal government would have to float the currency and interest rates and print no more dollars. So it would be tough to completely turn around the US dollar at this point, and it would be best if it was actually backed by something like gold. If states and other organizations want to create their own currencies, I think that's perfectly fine. I think a world where many different currencies compete is probably the best scenario in the future, and especially if those currencies are not controlled by central banks and central governments. You know, it doesn't have to be Bitcoin, but, you know, cryptocurrencies competing with currencies issued by governments and central banks. If the United States wanted to strengthen its dollar right now, they could float the currency, print no more dollars, and float interest rates. And what that means is allow it to compete in the actual marketplace. You wouldn't be adding any new dollars, so at very least, it shouldn't continue to exponentially fall off in value. And there would be nobody there to manipulate it. So like those dollars are out there and they exist, but no more are going to exist. And if you want to borrow them, that's a market interest rate. It's not set by this central bank, the Federal Reserve, arbitrarily. And so you end up wasting a lot of money with this easy to borrow money. If interest rates were higher, if that's what the market calls for, meaning that there's fewer things being produced, so you need to be more careful with the money, then you have to be more careful who you lend it to. You have to make sure the projects you're putting it into are going to be beneficial and profitable and useful. So that's really the reason why this would strengthen the United States as well. So basically, it's as easy as that. If I was emperor, we could really turn this around. The chances of any of this happening, let alone all of it, are basically slim to none. I don't know what we would have to do to try to vote the right people into office to get this done. Even if I ran for president, I don't think I'd be able to do any of this. So it's just an interesting intellectual exercise to be like, yeah, these problems could be solved if people were willing to solve them and if people were on the same page about what makes a country prosperous, about what we want the end goals to be. But clearly America is not on the same page with that. We don't share these common goals. We don't even share a common worldview or understanding of the way reality works. So to think that some reform like this could happen is really just absurd. But it is really dangerous to be living within this crumbling empire, to be living within reach of it, to be living inside of it, because empires on their way out, going down, don't tend to reform like I'm talking about here and make things a lot better. What they tend to do is double down on failed policies, become more confiscatory, take more tax money, take more property, issue more regulations, make it harder to do business. They debase their currency. Obviously, that's going to continue to happen. And they get into more conflicts, both internally and externally. So it can be dangerous living in a collapsing or declining empire. And you basically have to set yourself up to be able to thrive in its absence or thrive while it burns itself out. So it's not about fighting an empire. It's not about bringing down the empire. You certainly don't want to be in direct opposition on the front lines to that empire. What you want to do first is to make sure that you don't rely on any of the services or goods that collapse with the empire. So look at your life and how much you rely on that federal government and imagine where you would get those services and what you would do if suddenly the federal government wasn't there. And the second step is to make sure that you have the strength to survive in a vacuum or in an era of increased corruption. You know, obviously, I think the federal government becomes a danger at certain points with armed IRS agents trained to kill and FBI raiding over silly things. So clearly that's a problem, but you do also have to acknowledge that there are certain security concerns that the federal government does take care of right now. So are you able to protect yourself against random crime, gangs, thieves, and increased corruption, that sort of thing? And basically the way to do this is to build a parallel economy so that we have structures to rely on. So any of those things that the federal government's not going to be doing but you still need done, that's prime for a parallel economy business. Now, some of this with collapsing supply chains and this security that I was talking about, how the United States maintains so much security that allows trade, that does mean bringing supply chains closer to home and making sure more of what is produced in a local area, especially when it comes to really important things like food and energy. So that is definitely part of building the parallel economy. It's good for everybody to think about where our necessities come from and really try to plug in the holes there. And the way I imagine it is basically being able to live in a strong community. So you can get started by signing up below. Links are in the description. I'll send you a free resource on the types of parallel economy businesses that the world needs, some ideas on how you could build one of these businesses, start making money today. And I'm also going to send you more information about how we can build these self-sufficient communities that are poised to not just survive, but thrive in the coming years ahead. Check out those resources for free in the description below. If you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing, hit that little bell so you're notified, like this video, and comment below with your thoughts on if you think that this would actually restructure the United States empire to remain beneficial and thrive, or if you think that I'm way off base here. I'm Joe Jarvis. Thanks for watching. Come back and see me again soon.